Welcome back to Music Theory Logic. Andrew here, and today we're going to be talking about one of the more confusing audio effects around, at least to me when I was learning all this stuff, and still is the one I think that I have the most to continue to learn about, and that is compression. Let's go ahead into Logic. So I'm going to be using the default compressor today. We are in the Making It From Scratch number 15, and I'm talking about one of the pluck arpeggios that we built. It sounds like this without any compression. I thought this would be a cool one because there's obviously the stuff that's louder and the stuff that's quieter. And let's talk about what compression does so that you'll understand why that is. So, the compression, sorry, let me quit my photos here, is basically like it sounds, compressing, squeezing audio. So when we look at any recording of a vocal or recording of a guitar or MIDI controlled instrument, there are portions of the sound which are softer in volume and portions of the sound which are louder in volume. We operate in what's called a 0 dB scale, which means the loudest thing that's possible in any vocal or guitar track would be 0 dB. All right, as I decrease the threshold, more of the audio is getting compressed. So threshold is your first term to understand about compression. That is where the compression starts. So in this case, I have it at negative 30 decibels. So everything in the audio that is at negative 30 dB or above that, in other words, negative 20, negative 10, or 0 dB, is going to be compressed. All right. Now, how much is it going to be compressed by? How squeezed will it be? Well, that's dictated by our ratio. Our ratio is the amount of compression. So the ratio, the amount of squeezing that's happening above the threshold. So as I increase this, more compression would happen. As I decrease this, less compression would happen. And when I'm at 1:1, even though I'm at negative 30 dB, negative 31 of threshold, nothing happens. Because 1:1, the audio that's above negative 30 is being affected by a multiple of 1, which doesn't do anything. 5 times 1 is 5. All right. Now, as we increase the ratio, basically the stuff that's above the threshold is going to get closer to the actual threshold. So with a little bit, a ratio of 2:1, we basically have like a sloping that's happening above the threshold. So the loudest stuff is getting closer in volume. As we increase this, we are basically sausaging or squeezing, flatlining our audio. So everything that's above negative 30 is getting fully squeezed here. All right, so ratio is the amount of compression. All right, now knee, not all compressors have all these controls. I'm going to show you some of the two most famous compressors in existence in just a second. But a knee is what is the compressor doing in the actual moment of the threshold. So is there a knee? So a 0 knee would basically mean that the angle is totally hard. As we increase the knee, or as we soften the knee, as some people might say, it starts to bend there. So it's not a right angle. If we were to zoom in at negative 31 dB, there's like a curve happening. All right. So let's set this to negative 5. Now, attack and release are kind of like it sounds. Attack is when is this compressor attacking the audio. This is defined in terms of milliseconds. Excuse me. So if I have this at 0 milliseconds, it's happening instantly. If I have this at 90 milliseconds, it's happening 90 milliseconds after the audio starts. Release is how long after it starts does it affect the audio before it comes off. So I have this at 13 milliseconds. All right, now if I decrease our makeup gain, let's hear what happens. So here's no compression. Here's compression. Now, the first thing you noticed is probably that it went down in volume. Why did that happen? Well, we took audio that was loud and we made it less loud. And so the result is that the full audio is not as loud. So this is where makeup gain comes in. You always have to add more gain back in after you squeeze a signal. So ideally it's the same volume. Now, the way to learn how this compression is affecting your audio in the beginning when you're working with it, you want to avoid it just getting louder. Now, if I were to crank the makeup gain, it would get louder, but that's not purely because of the actual compression that's happening, but the gain we are adding back in after the compression. So let's get our makeup gain matched. Sounds close to me. All right, so no compression. Compression. Now, again, the reason I chose this channel to demonstrate compression on is because there was loud stuff and there was soft stuff. So the lowest volume thing on this track are the actual echoes, the delay. So you'll notice that without compression, those delays are softer. With the compression on, the delay is closer to the volume of the actual instrument. And if I were to really squeeze it, you really hear that delay go up in volume. So let's bring your threshold back down. Cool. So the next thing I want to demonstrate is the attack and release on this. As I make the attack go closer to instant, it starts to affect what we would call transients. Any real sound that happens that is percussive at all in nature, so like a plucked instrument, anything like a drum hit, or even a guitar pluck of a string. Right at the beginning, we have these things called transients, which are peaks in the audio, right? And we don't really want to squeeze those because you'll notice weird stuff starts to happen. So it almost sounds like more of a clicky type sound. Now what happens is I increase the delay. The compression's happening for much longer. The thing I notice with my ears when I'm hearing this is when the release is slower on this, we start to hear the reverb that's happening as part of our serum effect. More air, less air. Cool. So once again, every sound that you compress will be slightly different for what you hear. One of the things that I think of compression a lot with, because my musicianship really started with playing guitar. I did play piano before guitar, but guitar was really when I fell in love with all this music stuff. And if you think about compressing a guitar, what really happens is that the sound of the note gets closer to the sound of the attack of the string, or like, in other words, the pick or the sound of the fingers across the string. One thing that does is it makes the guitar sound like it was hit harder. If you listen to like Red Hot Chili Peppers guitars, they're super, super compressed, and that really gives them a kind of like extra power, if you will. Why do we compress things? Well, one, we can shape the audio, shape the sound, but two is much more of a practical reason. If I take a vocal, for instance, and the singer naturally is going to have quiet sections and loud sections, if I don't do any compression, the vocal's going to get lost when it's soft, or perhaps be too loud when it's loud. And so that would require for me to control the volume of that vocal more. So by compressing a vocal, we are, again, making it exist in less of a varying dynamic range. And then that allows you to have a more tameable, if you will, instrument to then mix with. So let's talk about some of the famous compressors out there. So there are two that come to mind. One is an 1176, and one is a Teletronics, the LA2A, which I think this is Universal Audio, but I believe that was bought by like Uri. Don't get mad at me if I'm wrong on that, but I know like Studio West, where I work, has a Uri 2A, and they have an LA2A, whereas the 1176 is all Universal Audio. So first of all, we see different controls. So if we look at the LA2A, there is gain, right? The amount of audio gain that we're adding back in, and then there's the peak reduction. There is not a threshold, and there's not a ratio. That's all kind of built into this peak reduction. So in theory, the more peak reduction I have, the more it's altering the audio that hits the actual compression. All right, then the amount of gain I add to the signal is kind of like affecting the threshold, because as I increase the gain, it's going to then fire this harder. So let's turn off this and let's play with our LA2A. All right, so our gain, again, making it louder. If I increase my peak, it got softer. So I have to add gain back in. Now, when we hear that, we would never actually do this kind of squeezing with an LA2A, but you notice that it sounds much more percussive and the delay is a lot closer to the original audio. All right, now, in part because of the actual controls that we have, and also in part because of the actual engineering of these devices, they work differently. Now, I'm not qualified or a specialist in the mathematics of how they work differently, or the actual electrical engineering of these outboard pieces of gear. But the way that I think about them is the way that a lot of mixing engineers that I've learned from, mostly virtually through their own sort of tutorial videos. But these each have their own sort of colors to them. I think an LA2A is typically thought to add some sparkle to it. It's really commonly used in vocals. Famously, Dr. Dre uses a Sony, I think, C9000 microphone into an outboard LA2A. Then an 1176 is, it gives us more control, first of all. And second of all, there are many different versions, I think 5 different editions of 1176. This with the blue face is referred to as a blue face 1176. Now, some of them had the full like British mode where you could turn on all of the ratio at the same time, which is kind of like an infinity ratio. We could have a ratio of 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 20-to-1. Our input and our output is kind of like our threshold. So the less audio I send in, if I'm not sending any, the needle's barely moving. As I send it in, more audio is above the threshold. So we see that the needle's basically smashing the whole time. All right, now output is where we control the actual gain. So that's would be basically our makeup gain from Logic's compressor. And then finally, we get attack and release controls. So we could create that clicky type sound. Which I don't really like. That's sort of squashing the actual transients if I increase the attack. actual sound of the pluck that we built isn't getting so manipulated and changing. So once again, all the different types of compressors, they have different controls to do the same thing to audio. If you look at your Logic compressor, they've got the Studio VCA, Studio FET, Classic VCA, Vintage VCA, Vintage FET, Vintage Opto. Now, the way that these are basically, you can think of them as like different algorithms to accomplish the same task. I will do a breakout video on these specific ones, but the one I have off the top of my head is the Vintage Opto. I know an Opto compressor basically would use a light bulb inside the compressor to turn on. So those were typically used for mastering compressors, and the reason for that is that since it takes a second for the light to come on, the actual treatment of the audio is going to be slightly softer in nature. But once again, with music and all this stuff, there are really no rules. I think some of the coolest sounds throughout time have been created from breaking the rules, but it's hard to break rules when you don't essentially know what the rules are and you don't know what these different components do. You could just mess with knobs and use your ear to hear what happens. But I think trying to understand threshold, ratio, attack and release is the most important. Makeup gain or adding gain back in is pretty obvious. The knee, we can kind of experiment with if we can hear the difference there. It's very subtle. This goes into why I think these are some of the harder plugins to master. But in essence, I think as we soften the knee or increase the knee, the compression in the moment feels softer. It's like with 0. If I go to 0 and further down, we hear almost like the metallic weird hit from that instrument. And that goes down a lot as we increase the knee. So once again, hopefully that helped you. Do not get overwhelmed. Once again, I found audio compression to be really, really confusing for many, many years. Once again, if this video wasn't enough, there's lots of other great resources out there. Go and check out videos and other representations of compression, and then use compressors. If you're working with a vocal, experiment with compression, and the more you do this, the more you will master what it's doing and why you would do that when you need compression. Hopefully that helped you. If that did help you, you would help me out a lot by subscribing to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. I'm constantly coming out with videos aimed at helping all sorts of different types of musicians understand more about music. And if you have any topics you'd like to see me cover, leave a comment. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time. Cheers.